Hi, my name is Bethany Smith, and in this presentation, I'm going to run through the results of the Wild Blean Species Prioritisation workshop that was held in May 2024. So the purpose of the workshop was to help Kent Wildlife Trust decide which species to prioritise for recovery, reintroduction, or conservation introduction in the Wild Blean landscape. Now, it's a pretty complex decision to make, so we need a set of tools to help us think through this problem systematically. And so we, which is the team that I work in at the Zoological Society of London, advocate for the use of structured decision making. This process is transparent, defensible, and recognises varied values of different groups of people, which can ultimately lead to better conservation outcomes. We tend to think of structured decision making as an iterative cycle. So the first thing that we need to do is to clarify the decision problem and then define the objectives. And this helps us to know exactly what it is that different groups of people want to achieve and how to measure those objectives. Then we develop alternative strategies, which is basically just a fancy way of saying that we look at combinations of actions that are available for achieving the objectives. So in this workshop, the available alternative strategies are basically different sets of species to prioritise. And then we model and predict the outcomes of each strategy in relation to the objectives. And it's pretty often that there isn't a clear winning strategy. So then we do trade-off analyses that can help us to make the decision. So to give a very brief overview of the workshop, it was essentially a 4-day-long workshop held in May 2024, and it was attended by 17 participants. It was facilitated by myself and 3 of my colleagues, Kyle Kennell, Caitlin Andrews, and John Ewan. In the workshop, we ran through the first 5 steps of the SDM cycle to go from a long list of approximately 1,400 species down to a short list of 22 species. And then from that short list, we built and evaluated 7 different species sets. So the first thing that we needed to do in the workshop was this first step of the decision cycle, which was to clarify the decision problem. So to do this, we created what we call a problem statement. And we did this together as a group to make sure that we're all working towards the same goal. And instead of me reading it out here, I'll just let you pause the video and read this in your own time if you want to. And then the second step was to define the objectives. And we spent a lot of time doing this as it's one of the most important steps of structured decision making. So at the end of the day, if you don't know where you're going, you can't really decide which path to take to get you there. So we spend a lot of time doing this. And at the end of the activities and discussions, we identified 5 key objectives that everybody in the room really cared about. And those 5 objectives were to maximise species value, maximise public support, maximise naturalness, maximise net positive impact on other native species, and to minimise cost. And then as you can see in the figure at the bottom of the slide, so this one, these key objectives were further split into little sub-objectives. So for example, participants felt that species value should be valued, that species should be valued on their ecosystem functions, their flagship potential, conservation impact, and also just generally based on their intrinsic value. And then just for a bit of clarity here, maximise naturalness related to the participants valuing the type and extent of management required for different species and basically how this would affect how natural a system felt. So essentially species that would require sort of permanent or semi-permanent fencing wouldn't feel as natural as species that didn't require any kind of fencing off of areas of the Blean. And then once the objectives were all agreed upon by the group, we set about developing the alternative strategies. But to do that, we needed to narrow down from that long list of 1,400 species to a more manageable amount. So we did this first by asking participants to brainstorm species from the long list that they felt were important for the Blean, and asked them to split those species between their ecosystem function, intrinsic value, conservation impact, and flagship potential. And ultimately, at the end of that, that gave us a list of 122 species that the participants had brainstormed, and then we then asked them to vote on those species. So to do that, we gave each participant 50 votes that they had to stratify across different groupings of taxa. And all species receiving a vote from at least half of the participants were retained, and ultimately that left us with a list of 54 species. And then how we narrowed that list of 54 species to 22 is quite a bit more complex. So I'm going to go into that in a little bit more detail now, as that involved species scoring, objectives weights, and then some ranking as well. So in this step, the first thing that we did was score each species against the objectives according to the scoring criteria that was created in the workshop. And again, I can't read all of these out, so please feel free to pause the video and have a look in your own time if you want to. This was a sort of quick scoring system that we came up with in the workshop for each objective. Once we had that scoring system, and once we'd scored each species, we asked each participant to assign weights to each objective, which is basically just essentially asking participants how much they care about each objective relative to the others. So you'll probably notice that of the 5 objectives, there's only 4 here, and that's because we didn't include cost at this point, as we felt that the cost of the species should not be considered when deciding how much overall use or utility it has. And then the size of each coloured bar shows you how much each participant valued each objective. So, for example, participant G put a lot of weight on species value, so this blue bar, and less so on public support. So there's not as much of the yellow bar showing as in comparison to some of the other participants. And then based on each species score for each objective and how much each participant cared about each objective, we were then able to calculate an overall utility score for each species for each participant. And this is a value that ranges from 0 to 1 and indicates how much that species brings to the table for each participant. So I included a few examples on this slide that you can feel free to have a look at, but just to show you a little bit. So if we take this top left graph, so for adders, you can see that, for example, participant D gets more utility from adders than, say, participant E. And then the colours of the bars show you which sort of objectives make up that utility. And then once we'd calculated the utility scores, we then ranked the species for each participant and took each participant's top 20 species. Now, this graph is a little hard to see, but it basically shows you for each species on the y-axis, the points along the x-axis are a point for each participant, and that's the utility score. So let me zoom in a little bit. So hopefully now you can see that a bit clearly, or a bit more clearly, should I say. So if we just look, for example, at the Eurasian golden oriole, what we can see is that each point is a utility score for each participant, and if it ranked within the top 20 for each participant, then it's got a colour between on a blue to green gradient. If it's not within their top 20, then it's coloured in grey. And so then what we did is we took the proportion of the top 20 lists that each species was featured in and calculated and then used that to determine the final species shortlist. And we didn't have a set value in mind for this in terms of what the proportion should be, but the goal was to obtain a shortlist of approximately 20 species. So the species and the proportions were ordered and all the species included until the first big sort of step decrease in the proportion after we had approximately 20 species. And ultimately that produced a shortlist of 22 species. And those are the ones in the table that you can now see. And then once we had that more manageable shortlist of 22 species, the participants were separated into 2 groups and asked to select species from this list to create 2 species sets around different self-determined themes. And in the end, each alternative set contained 5 to 9 species, with Eurasian beaver being the only species included in all 4 alternatives. And so those 4 species sets shown here in this table are set 1, 2, 3, and 4. And again, we didn't ask groups. We didn't give the categories to the groups. So these were self-determined around wood and water species that had conservation impact, species that the group felt were complementary to each other, and then species that people felt would be introduced or recovered based on their ecosystem functions. And you can also see that there are 3 other species sets in this table. So the first one is just all 22, so all of the shortlisted species. And the other 2 were dictated, so those on the bottom were dictated by the current species being considered by Kent Wildlife Trust for prioritisation. So they represent the 2030 vision for Kent Wildlife Trust and the 2030 plus vision, which is just an additional 3 species from the 2030 vision. And those species do include species that were not in the final shortlist of the 22 species that we developed during the workshop, but they were in that longer list of the 54 species that were brainstormed and voted on, so we already had the scoring for them. So then, similar to how we scored each individual species, we then scored each species set against the objectives, and this time did include cost. And the set that scored the highest, or the joint highest for each objective in this table, is coloured in dark green, and then the one that scored the lowest is in light green. And the way that the scores were aggregated in the short time span that we had in the workshop did mean that the full set of all 22 species had a kind of an inherent advantage to score higher due to having more species in it, because we were basically aggregating up the scores. So where the full set scored the highest, these are actually shown in blues. So a dark blue and a light blue for the lowest and for the highest and then the lowest. And actually, those that scored the sort of second highest and second lowest after that are shown in dark green and light green, respectively. So as you can kind of see, there's no clear winning set that always has the best outcomes for each objective. So for example, this 2030 vision, this last column, yes, it has a lot of dark green, so it scored the best for a lot of the objectives, but it's also a lot of light green, so it also scored the worst for a lot of the objectives, compared to, say, the 2030 vision, which is kind of middling throughout. And then the rest are just a bit of a mixed bag, really, on how they perform. So because there's no clear winning set, we asked the participants again to assign weights to the different objectives so that we could calculate the overall utility score for each set for each participant. And these final scores are shown on the graph on the right. So where you can see that the highest utilities were in the full set, set 1 and set 4. So these sort of come out on top compared to the other ones. Basically, here's the table again, just to remind you which species are in those sets. And so that was the process. And in the end, we didn't finish the workshop with a chosen set between those top ranking 3 sets. But it was notable, actually, that workshop participants did have similar top ranking sets, despite being from different sectors and expressing varied objective weights. And we think overall everyone was really happy with the structured decision-making process and the outputs. All of the workshop materials have now been passed to Kent Wildlife Trust. And because this process is this iterative cycle, it can be sort of cycled through again and updated with new information when that becomes available. So, for example, the participants in this workshop expressed that having more specialist knowledge, particularly on plants and invertebrates, might have changed the species that were shortlisted. So that could be rerun and updated if necessary. So that's a pretty short summary-ish of the workshop process and outputs, but all of the details, if you want to read more into it, because trust me, there are a lot more details. They can all be found in the workshop report if you want to delve into it in a bit more. So finally, I want to say a big thank you to all of the workshop participants who gave their time and made this possible. And also thanks to Kent Wildlife Trust, in particular Kirsty and Helen, who organised the workshop with us. Thanks also to Canterbury Christ Church University for hosting the workshop, and to Rewilding Britain for funding the workshop through Kent Wildlife Trust. And then finally, if you do have any questions about the process, whether specific to this workshop or just structured decision making in general, please do drop me an email. It's on the slide. Thank you very much.